economic development. And so I thought I'd start with a frame that I think is probably pretty familiar to everybody, this notion of we have to choose between the economy and the environment. And these are images that I'm sure all of you have seen similar concepts for a long time. And well, let me start with one thing. You guys are college students, which I assume means that you enjoy irony. So I'm going to point out the irony here. This is a political ad that arrived in my mailbox last fall in a local election held for our county council. These are the 4 candidates who were widely considered to be the environmental champions. They're endorsed by the Sierra Club, by the Conservation Voters, those sorts of things. This is an ad obviously supported by paid for by people supporting their opponents. What's ironic here is that they're literally labeled threat to jobs. And if you look at the careers of these 4 guys, 2 of them have founded organizations or founded businesses that both are involved in recycling in different areas. They're employing more than 100 people in our community. Their opponents did not have any similar business experience or background. Incredibly ironic from my perspective, but an effective message. And so to the extent that I have something like a thesis for this loose jumble of ideas I'm about to spill at you, it's that this kind of thing happens all the time, and that it doesn't make sense, and it's bad, and we should do something about it. So before I launch into a couple of sort of local case studies on economic development and clean energy, I thought I'd talk for just a moment about the ways that we measure different kinds of, the ways that we measure economic development. As a program manager, I'm really interested in how you measure things and how measurement leads to results. And in popular discussion of the economy, we hear a lot of different things which I think are used differently in discussion and are oftentimes competing with each other. And I will also start by saying that I'm not an economist. I took exactly 2 econ classes when I was here. So I don't have a lot of background in this, but I know that when things don't add up. So the first thing that we often hear about discussed, and it's certainly at the beginning of most of the political discussions, is about jobs. And there are a lot of complexities when we talk about counting jobs, right? The first is a question of how many jobs and how long they'll last, right? You'll hear this will create 2,000 construction jobs. Well, those construction jobs could be completed in 6 months or a year and then completely gone. That's an important question to ask. How good are these jobs is an important consideration, right? Are these $10 an hour jobs, or are these prevailing wage jobs? Are these jobs that come with benefits, those kinds of things? And then I think it's also worth pointing out that from an economist's perspective, it's frequently the case that creating jobs is not the smartest thing to do with money, right? Because from a purely economic perspective, the best thing to do is get the most work done for the least cost. But from a political perspective, everybody wants to be able to say, yeah, we've created these jobs. Second way we often talk about economic development is in terms of economic activity, the gross domestic product. Many of you have probably heard that the sort of common criticism of measuring the economy through gross domestic product, which is that if I leave here and get hit by a car and I rack up $1 million worth of medical expenses, that the net result is an improvement for the local economy. So it's a measurement. It is not a perfect measurement. And then the last thing the last thing that we often hear the last way we often discuss economic development is through the success of one or clusters of businesses. Again, it's an indicator, but it is not a perfect one, because what you'll often hear is, well, this is good for business, not necessarily good for all businesses when something's good for one specific company. So those are just some kind of broad generalizations about the way that we measure economic development before I talk about how we have measured economic development in a couple of clean energy areas locally. So the first thing I'll talk about is the community energy challenge. And I should have said at the beginning, I'm happy to pause and take questions as we're going here. I probably have enough content for part of, but not for all of the next hour. So if you want to be here for the whole time, make sure you're asking questions. So the Community Energy Challenge is a program that we've implemented locally since the beginning of 2009. The idea of this program is to do two things. This came out of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act initially. That's the stimulus package that was launched at the beginning of the recession. And our purpose with this program was to do two things, was to create jobs and to save energy. And the way that we do that is by working with small businesses and homeowners to develop energy efficiency projects in their homes and businesses, to help them make it easy to complete those projects by giving them good information about what it makes sense to do. So starting with an energy audit, and then helping them put on one page all of the kinds of improvements that they can do in their building and comparing them side by side. So it's not the Windows person selling you Windows and saying what you really need is new Windows, and then the furnace guy comes in and says, oh, you got to get a new furnace. And you have no apples to apples comparison of which is better. So we put all of those kinds of improvements on one page, make it easy for homeowners and businesses to figure out how to do that. We help train the contractor base to make sure people are doing the work to the same quality standards. And then we help make sure that people take advantage of all of the utility rebates, make sure that they take advantage of the grant funds that we've been able to provide, and help them line up financing for their projects. So since the program launched in 2010, we've worked with about 1,500 homeowners, and we've completed more than 1,100 residential retrofit projects. So more than half of the homes that we've worked with in getting an initial energy assessment have moved forward with the project. They're saving about a quarter of their energy, and adds up to about $470 a year. And that's at an average cost of a little over $6,000 per project. This is a slide about how difficult it is to make commercial energy efficiency projects interesting to look at. Since this is a ductless mini split heat pump, which is awesome. It reduces electric consumption by to approximately a third of what it was before compared to baseboards, but they are really boring beyond that. And insulation on the roof of a building isn't very interesting, but it is an effective way to cut your energy costs. So we've worked with about 400 businesses and completed close to 200 energy efficiency retrofits at those companies. Altogether, that's adding up to a savings of $650,000 a year for energy. And those are costs that those homeowners and business owners would have incurred that they are not incurring, that they can reinvest in their companies, that they can spend buying groceries or whatever else those homeowners want to spend that money on. From a greenhouse gas perspective, it's the equivalent of taking 1,300 cars off the road, and it has added about $16 million to our local economy. Yeah.
Is that taking into account that a lot of the power is coming from hydro or not?
It does. It does. There's a very complicated answer to that question, but yes, it does take that into account. And so we try to talk about job creation, and one of the challenges that we've had under the Economic Stimulus Act, we were required to report job creation numbers on a quarterly basis, and we kept track of people's pay stubs and how many hours they worked on all of these projects, and it's first of all, it's a paperwork nightmare. It's also a not effective way to talk about the economic impact. because those numbers fluctuate from quarter to quarter. And so you try and add it up, and we have moved away from that, mostly because it's a paperwork nightmare, but it's not a great way to keep track of job creation. What we now try and talk about is how many people are employed working on these projects for at least part of the time. There's more than 85 people in any given year that are working on these energy efficiency projects. They work for 25 different contractors, and one of the ways that we try to communicate effectively about this is by listing the names of those businesses, because particularly at a local level, many people who you talk to here in Whatcom County or in the surrounding areas will know people who work at these businesses or will be familiar with these companies. So I have business cards with me today, and if anybody wants to do an internship similar to the one that generated these results, I'm always interested in connecting folks to interesting projects. We've got lots of interesting research we could do on these programs. Last year, Graham Marmion, who graduated in the spring, completed this economic impact analysis for us. And what we found was that for every dollar of public funds invested in this program in 2013, there was $5.27 in local economic activity. And that's basically a function of three factors. The first factor is that we put money into discounting energy audits, into paying to help put together those reports that help people make smarter decisions, into quality assurance and contractor training. Homeowners and business owners put most of the money into paying for the actual retrofit work on their building. So it immediately leverages at a rate that's better than 1-to-1, closer to 2-to-1. And then on top of that, all of that money that's spent has the economic multipliers. So if you're working on one of those projects, you have more money in your pocket, you spend some of that money locally, and it recirculates through the economy. And the economic multiplier on this kind of construction work is higher than the economic multiplier on most other kinds of economic activities. The third thing that factors into that $5.27 is, of course, that these homeowners and business owners are spending less on their utility bills from then on out. And so there is over the next 15 or 20 years, there's a continuous stream of essentially income that's added into the community because of those reduced costs. So this is a slightly more complicated way of saying what I just finished saying, which is that but it demonstrates, it sort of gives you a sense of the magnitude of each of those things. So in 2013, we spent $1.6 million in public funds. So that's the first bar. Second bar is those public funds plus the money that the homeowners and business owners spent. The third bar shows all of those funds plus the economic multiplier effect. The fourth bar, the tall one in the middle with the red at the top, that shows the value of the energy savings, the net present value for those of you with econ backgrounds, the net present value of those future energy savings. Then we shift the bar down because, essentially because when you're doing these kinds of analysis, you don't want to imagine that the initial money came from nowhere and would have done nothing else, right? So the initial $1.6 million was tax funds that could have been used, if it hadn't been used on this, could have been used on something else. We imagined that it was used to give the middle class a tax break, and then imagined what the middle class would do with those dollars. And if they had done that, it would have had an economic effect, but a less significant economic effect than what we did with it. Does that make sense? All right. I'm not as accustomed to talking about to describing these that piece. So then the final piece there is one that I like to talk about when I'm discussing this with the policymakers, the ones who control the public funds that are initially invested, because all of the money that we spend has taxes paid on it. And some of that goes to the federal government, about 300 or 350,000, and a little less than 300 is paid in state and local taxes on that total $8.5 million. And so when you imagine that, we spent $1.6 million, but we created $600,000 in new tax revenues. So the next question is that economic multiplier any good? I think that's, unfortunately, that was the question I had at the outset of this research. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that question because there aren't apples-to-apples comparisons. So the work that we usually do, we provide energy performance scores to homeowners, and you can compare one house to another, and you can say this house is doing pretty well and this house is doing better. I don't know that there's a good way to do these kind of economic analyses and compare them side by side for different kinds of public spending. You would have to have the same consulting firm providing those economic analyses for all of the different options for things you can spend public funds on. The other thing that I was hoping we would be able to do with this analysis, and the granularity just isn't there in the tools, is answering the question of how do we make our economic multiplier better? So, for example, we have a contractor that works with the program that has really made has made a really serious effort to focus all of their spending back in the local economy. And they keep track of where the goods and services that they're buying are coming from, and making sure that they're shopping at hardware sales and not Home Depot, essentially. And we think that probably has the impact of dramatically increasing the economic multiplier of spending done by that company, but we don't have the granularity to measure that in this model. That's going to require a much more detailed tool than we have available right now. So I like to think of this analysis as a tool for starting a conversation about economic development and how energy efficiency can do that, rather than something that we can use really effectively for measuring success. So we developed this as a tool for talking with funders and budget writers, community leaders, business peoples, and college students. The methodology that we used, I could talk to you quite a lot about the methodology and the assumptions that we made. Graham could talk to you a lot more about that, but I don't think that's probably the most interesting thing for people, and we tend to, well, for example, I tend to not talk about this graph with most audiences, and I really stick to these kind of 3 bullet points when discussing this. And so we try and think of this as a way to tell a story rather than being the story itself. So the second thing I wanted to talk to you about as a success story in economic development is solar energy. And oftentimes the first thing folks think is, well, it's dark outside and it's just after 4 o'clock and it's rained all day, and does it even work in Washington? And the honest answer is that solar actually really does work effectively in Washington state, because most of our daylight, if you think about it, every location on the Earth's surface gets an average of 12 hours of sunlight per day. And if you're at the equator, that's 12 hours a day every day of the year. If you're here, it's closer to 8 hours a day during the winter, and closer to 16 hours a day during the summer. And when we're getting those long 16-hour days, that's when the sky's clear. And so our opportunity to produce energy is concentrated right at the time when we're getting those clear skies, and that's what makes solar an effective investment in Washington state. That, coupled with regulation of the electric industry that's that is favorable to solar production. And that, plus the fact that the cost of solar panels continues to drop. This slide is old. It's dropped by closer to 20% in the last few years. And in Bellingham, we're seeing paybacks on solar installations in the range of 5, 6, 7, 8 years, which is a range where you can start to talk to business owners about, does this make sense to do for your building, and is this a good thing for you to spend your money on, and not have it be just hobbyists and climate change, folks focused on solving climate change and reducing their greenhouse gas footprint. This is something that you can say, look, this thing's going to pay for itself in 6 years, and it's warranted for 25. That starts to sound compelling, and that's then a point where you can start communicating with financial institutions. We have one in the room right now who's done a number of solar loans. We can start talking about financial institutions about, does it make sense for you to make loans for businesses, for homeowners, and to focus attention on freeing up capital for clean energy development. This graph shows that payback period a little more graphically, and when you sit down with people and show them this kind of information, it starts to make sense. And this graph depicts the growth of solar. It's outdated, but that trend since 2012 has only continued on that same exponential curve. The number of installations going in our region is increasing dramatically, and it's not driven exclusively by concern about climate change. It's driven by the underlying fact that it makes economic sense to put these systems in. As I mentioned, there's regulations and rules in place that make economic sense. And those are driven by, those rules were written by state legislators who wanted to see the development of clean energy industry in our state. And sorry.
Thank you. In response to the last graph, how much
Yeah.
of that growth has been in relation, direct or indirect, to state subsidies on solar installation?
Nearly everything that's on this graph since 2007 or 2008, when the net meter, when the state's production credit went into effect, nearly everything will have taken advantage of those the state subsidies, the production credit. It doesn't make sense to put systems in that and not take advantage of those funds.
The only way someone would have done that is if they put in a system that didn't meet the subsidy requirements by not buying Washington products, et cetera, right?
Even if you don't buy Washington products, you still get a reduced credit.
Full subsidy in that way.
Correct. Yeah. In fact, the in-state panels only started to become available in the last year or so of this graph. So that trend has continued. There's 2 solar manufacturers in Washington. One of them's located in Bellingham, the north end of town, and they're employing about 75 people now. It's been fantastic to watch that company start up and grow so rapidly. And in addition to the 75 manufacturing jobs, there's dozens of people in this community and dozens more in many other communities all around Washington in installation, actually putting the systems up on roofs and connecting them to the grid. So this is a real success story for economic development and clean energy. This one is a little bit less of a success story. I'm smiling at Jeff now because Jeff sat in a lot of public meetings as the wind energy ordinance was crafted and recrafted for Whatcom County. In 2010, 2011, abbreviating this story, Jeff, and that's making me nervous that you're sitting there because I'm going to tell the short version of a very long story. But there was a proposal to develop community wind systems in Whatcom County. The developer was looking at several different sites. One of them was up on Galbraith Mountain here. You can see this is an artistic rendition of what it would look like, but from the dock at Lake Padden. But the tower itself would have been 100 meters tall, would have been a 2 to 3 megawatt facility, which is approximately enough electricity to power 1,000 homes. And what I think is particularly compelling, particularly interesting about the model that Cascade Community Wind had put together was that it was community-owned systems. That means that the capital behind putting this system in, the money used to pay for this, would have come from a conglomeration of owners within our community. And so rather than all of the profits sort of dribbling out to other parts of the country, as happens with investor-owned enterprises, those profits would have remained here in Whatcom County. So we ended up with a. I'm actually going to skip this. This is boring. We ended up with a 2.5-year-long process to write and rewrite rules that would govern where wind energy systems can be put in Whatcom County. Those systems, the end result of that was that there are no locations left in Whatcom County where it is economically feasible to put in effective working wind energy systems. Everywhere where the wind speeds are adequate to justify putting in a substantial investment like this, they are not allowed. That's the short version. And even if they were allowed there, the requirements for measuring the sound and the volume that they're not allowed to exceed is virtually impossible to meet. 45 decibels at the property line. I'm talking at probably between 55 and 60 decibels right now. And that's at the property line, not at the nearest building. So what I take from this is, and I think this is difficult. Yeah, sorry.
Is that those sites, are those all on land, or is any thought as to moving into offshore wind?
So this is only looking at Whatcom County. It wouldn't make sense to put it like in Bellingham Bay. There are some companies exploring putting them on the Pacific coast, like off the Olympic Peninsula. So that is under consideration, but not in the Puget Sound. So the
Is there any push to get the county council to revisit this?
Since there's been a new council, no. I mean, the idea has been brought up. Unfortunately, the developer of this project has sort of moved on and is not available to keep doing these projects right now. So until and unless somebody comes back and says, yeah, I've got some money and I want to put these in, there's the potential to spend a lot of political capital on something that isn't going to result in any actual clean energy development. That's kind of my read on where that is.
Developer with an unfriendly policy.
Right. Yeah. No, it's definitely a chicken and egg problem, which is why it would have been better to have done it right in the first place. So I guess the reason I wanted to bring this. Sorry.
I was just going to ask, what again was the kilowatt per hour utilization of the average utilization of the wind plant that was looking to be put in?
So they looked at several different sizes, and that wasn't finalized at the stage that this project was at in its sort of permitting cycle. but as large as a 2.5 megawatt plant, wind energy system, which would have, which is enough to power about 1,000 homes.
What was the minimum size that would have to use for it to be economically efficient?
Jeff might be better able to answer those questions. Jeff actually worked for Cascade Community Wind for a couple of years there, but they put in systems that were what, 150 kilowatts.
This one is 2.25, quarter of a megawatt.
Okay.
Kids aren't counting the picture.
Right. So they put in much smaller systems, but those ones are right on the edge of cost effective, and they're right on the edge of cost effective near Ellensburg, where the wind speeds are much better than they are here. So essentially, the boring part of the slide that I started with said that the economics of wind energy systems get better and better the larger the tower gets, and to make it work in a place where the wind resource is marginal, where wind speeds are slower, you need larger systems. And the reason I wanted to discuss this issue in the context of economic development is because I started off by saying that this developer had a proposal where the profits would all stay in the community, where we're talking about projects that were going to be funded mostly by private capital, where we were talking about projects that were happening mostly on private land, and where we were constructing things, creating jobs, and there was going to be maintenance jobs that existed over the long term. That sounds like a lot of other projects that are not environmentally friendly and are justified as making sense from an economic development perspective. But we were unsuccessful at communicating this as an economic development opportunity. And I don't have an answer to tell you why we were unsuccessful at that or what we should have done better, but only to bring it up as in that context. The last thing I wanted to sort of bring up as we're sort of talking about economic development and where and how we talk about that in the context of clean energy is looking into the next year or couple of years and the proposals that are on the table in Washington state government to put a price on carbon. How many folks in the room are familiar with the idea of carbon tax or cap and trade? Okay, I can make some assumptions there. How many of you have an opinion about which one's better? Okay, all right. I'm not actually going to talk about which one's better. I think it's actually the case that the two are starting to get closer and closer as we start talking about ways that you can have a cap associated with carbon taxes, or that you can provide some price certainty under a cap and trade system. The two start seeming less like opposites and more like there's a lot of middle ground between the two. In any case, Washington state government is seriously contemplating how we can meet legislatively adopted greenhouse gas reduction targets, and the analysis that has been done suggests that there's not a clear way to do that without adopting a market mechanism, either a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. The argument that we're likely to hear, that we're going to hear, that we are already hearing, is that this is terrible for the economy. So this is another mailer that showed up in my mailbox this last year that's talking about how cap and trade system or a carbon tax is going to impact our local economy. What I want to emphasize here is that this information on this mailer is not backed up by data. That may not have been apparent based on the design, but the data that's been developed in Washington by the Office of Fiscal Management in Washington State shows that the carbon pricing mechanism, when you look at the entire state's economy, is actually a net positive. So if you bear with some really boring graphs, I'm almost done here. But these graphs depict one of two, they contemplated two scenarios, both blends of different carbon pricing mechanisms, carbon tax or a cap and trade, but with a lower price and then another scenario with a higher price. Obviously the lower price has less carbon reduction associated with it, the higher price has more carbon reduction associated with it. But for purposes of doing the economic analysis, they looked at these two scenarios and they said, what's the impact on employment over the next, over the next 20 years? And what they found is that it's really difficult to see much difference at all, but it's actually the lower price, at the lower price for carbon, it's actually a slight net positive for total employment in Washington State to implement a carbon tax, as long as that money gets, the money that's used for the tax is reinvested in the economy. Same if you're looking at the gross domestic product for the Washington State at a small carbon price, at a low carbon price. There is a slight increase over the next 20 years in the value or in the total gross domestic product for Washington State. Again, if you're looking at distribution of that wealth and personal income, there's a slight increase in the personal income over the next 20 years at the lower price for carbon. Looking at the higher price for carbon, this is the last of the boring graphs. There is a similar pattern. The total employment actually increases slightly less than under the other scenario, and it's closer to even for gross domestic, for the state's gross domestic product. It stays right about even when you look at that. So I guess what I wanted to leave with, or what I wanted to sort of finish and then begin a discussion with, is that in my experience and looking at data, it is often the case that clean energy development is one of the smartest ways that we can impact our economy. And it's my observation, without a whole lot of without a clear path forward from here, it is my observation that we need to be doing a better job of telling that story and communicating about it. And what I can conclude is it's probably not showing people graphs that's going to persuade people, but that we do need to be doing a better job of communicating about clean energy development and how that impacts and how that has a strong positive impact on our local economies. We've got a fair amount of time left. I'm happy I'd love to keep having a conversation, and maybe one of you knows how to do a better job of that communication.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. Sorry, yes.
So you started off talking about the community energy challenge.
Yeah.
Bellingham's also involved in the Georgetown contest.
Yes.
Are you guys working with that? That's more of a near-term energy reduction.
It is. We almost view them as kind of the same thing to some extent. The Georgetown University Energy Prize is a competition between cities all over the United States to see which one can reduce energy consumption in the residential and municipal sectors over the next 2 years. And the winner gets a $5 million prize. So it's kind of an exciting thing, and it's an opportunity for us to take the work that we've been doing and use it to prove that we're better than everybody else. So we would view the Community Energy Challenge as one of the tools that we're using to help Bellingham, and also, by the way, Anacortes and San Juan County are both also competing. Help those communities be competitive in that challenge.
Again, an intern that's been working, we've had funded Integra Energy
Oh,
Studies is
I should
an
mention that.
intern to
Yeah.
work with Sustainable Connections brokered the deal, but it's through the city of Bellingham.
Right.
So that's happening.
Yep. Other questions? Yeah.
Could you go back to the last graph for a moment?
Maybe. This is an old version of.
Looking at that graph, it wasn't obvious. I mean, I see a line that goes up. I mean, could you talk me through that graph and explain it to me?
Maybe.
Obviously, everybody else, but I mean.
Yeah. So let's start with. So this is looking at the number of jobs in Washington State, and this is this is time along the bottom, and the blue line is anticipated number of jobs, projected number of jobs, business as usual, with no carbon pricing, and the red line is assuming that that there is in this case the lower carbon pricing.
Bottom line is imposing a carbon tax has zero impact, either positive or negative, on.
In terms of total employment, so it has next to zero. It's actually, if you get a microscope out, you can see that there's actually a slight increase in total number of jobs in Washington State.
22 more jobs.
Yeah.
In 2035 as a result. I'm sure that number has very low error associated.
Right. But it's really important to those 22 families. Yeah. So but what is interesting here is that there is a shift in which industries those jobs are in, right?
20,000, sorry.
Yeah. So it's not a non-zero effect, but in terms of the total number of jobs, it is. Once you factor in a account margin for error, it's the same. Yeah.
If you go back to that slide where it showed the two houses, one was a thermal, it looked like a thermal gauge.
No, that one.
Explain what this color,
So this is one of the mechanisms we use for, and this is a thermal image of a house. It's one of the mechanisms we use as part of the Community Energy Challenge to figure out, as part of the energy audits that we do for homeowners. So this is how you figure out where heat is escaping from your house. So you look at it on a cold day, and wherever it's red, you can see, for example, in this house, there's there's heat escaping through the roof, and then there's also heat escaping under the attic windows there.
and then the turquoise green, or the green is insulated.
Right. Where heat is not escaping. Yeah. Yeah. So it's one of the tools that we use for measuring.
Is it mostly politicians pushing the message that it's not economically viable, or are there businesses that would kind of benefit from pushing that also?
Oh, I think it's probably. So this goes back to the point I was trying to make at the beginning, that when you talk about something being good for business or not good for business, that there's often, really there's a specific set of interests there. It's not good for this business, or it is good for this business. For example, if you look at carbon pricing in Washington State, when you get into the granularity of the job and economic activity data, what you see is that there's a lot less economic activity in oil refining, and there's more economic activity in other sectors. So total number of jobs, total number of dollars circulating in the economy is the same, but less of it is flowing through certain hands in certain pockets. And those people are probably typically pretty aware of those impacts. Bruce?
So in a carbon revenue model, whether it's the lower revenue or higher revenue,
Yep.
the other half of that is, where does that revenue go
Right.
once raised?
Right.
I think economic activity, I mean, what's
Sure. Well, so what they did for the model, they had to make some assumptions in making these models, right? And so the assumptions that they made for this is that they're what they call, I'm sorry, they were not revenue neutral, but they were near revenue neutral. Most of the money that's raised through a tax on pollution gets returned to the public through a couple of mechanisms: general tax, tax reductions in B&O tax, and I think property tax, reductions in B&O tax and property taxes. And then there were some reductions that were, or money was spent reducing, or essentially writing checks to low-income families, so that, you know, the folks for whom a slight increase in their energy costs will be a meaningful impact on their budget. That's offset by essentially a check paid for through the tax. And then I think this model had, as I recall, a 5%, an assumption of 5% of those funds was returned to the state general, or was given to the state general fund. What's interesting, though, is, sorry, one second. What's interesting, though, is that in the last couple of days, there's been a lot of discussion. Trying to think about where I read that. Oh, it's in the Cascadia Weekly. There's been a lot of discussion about the possibility. Many of you probably know that the state government's budget is somewhere between $3 and $5 billion in the hole when you account for all of the education funding that they have been told they're going to have to do, but haven't figured out how to pay for yet. For the next biennium, we're a couple of $1 billion behind. Trying to figure out where that money could come from. The governor is saying, look, there's not that many cuts we can possibly make. We can't do it with cuts only. And there's, of course, a lot of resistance to raising taxes, but a tax on pollution has the opportunity to perhaps be easier to stomach than an increase in other available taxes. So that's, you know, this model made certain assumptions. I would not make those same assumptions. I would not assume that those assumptions are going to be what the legislature ends up coming up with. But I think it is the case that as long as that money gets recirculated back into the economy, those two lines, the baseline and the what happens under the carbon tax scenario, they're going to be right about the same place because money keeps circulating in the economy. It doesn't have a dramatic effect one way or the other. Yeah.
Earlier when you were talking about solar energy and its economic efficiency, I assume you were talking about strictly residential.
Those two ends of the pole that I was looking at were, so between 5 and 8 years. 5 years is closer to what we're seeing for installing it on commercial sites. And the 7 or 8 years is more like what we're seeing on residential sites.
Is there any viability there for installing it for the purpose of adding to the electric grid in Washington State, or in any various portion of the electric grid?
Yes, sort of. It actually makes more sense to install it, install systems individually on specific buildings where it's essentially canceling out their energy use, rather than put in, you know, say big fields of solar panels in eastern Washington. The reason for that is because you eliminate the line losses. About 7% of the electricity that's produced in this country is lost in transmission. If you produce it right where you're using it, then you eliminate that inefficiency.
One last follow-up question.
Yeah.
In relation to that, on those case-by-case installations, is there enough electricity produced at peak times to feed back into the electric grid, or does it pretty much stay?
Yes. Yep. All of those systems that I showed are what they call net metered. This isn't the sort of off-grid, you know, cabins with battery backups. Those aren't even accounted for in the numbers I showed. These are what they call net metered systems, where you connect it to your meter at times when you're producing more than you're consuming, you know, noon and August. Nobody's home. The lights are all off. There's no electricity being used. That electricity flows back into the grid and is powering the neighbor's house or the business down the block. And then, you know, right now, for example, I have solar panels on my house. Right now, well, there's nobody home. There's nothing on at my house right now. But if there were, it would be drawing from the grid, but it would be using the credit that I built up in August.
Okay.
So the sizing on the system on my house, I have a credit that I use over the course of the year, and I'm not quite neutral, but I produce about 95% of the electricity that I use on an annual basis, and that's how the accounting is done for the cost purposes. Of course, it does mean that over time, as we increase the total amount of solar, we need to start thinking about storage systems that are available so that we can run things at night and in the winter. Yeah.
What size system do you have?
For my house, it's 3 kilowatts.
Aside from the regulatory hurdles putting up community wind, say on Gulf Mountain, what would the payback period for that be? I mean, you mentioned for photovoltaics, residential installation here, the payback was 6 or 8 years. You know, if I put in on Galbraith,
Yeah.
if I bought into it, what would
Jeff, do you want to tackle that one, or do you want me to guess? Yeah.
Depended on the positive purchase power agreement, you use out
Right.
electric, and that's gone, that's changed.
Yeah. Well, so
5 years ago, there was positive purchase power, and the buy it for a great power at a higher rate, and now it's very low. So I don't know what it was.
So our Sustainable Connections bought one share in one of the systems that was put up in Ellensburg, and for a number of reasons, that system is not the same as what we would see if we put it up on Galbraith. But I think I figured we'd get our money back at 10 years, and it's a 20-year share. So it's not an incredibly compelling business case, but as a first start, and as something that creates clean energy.
So the argument is better for photovoltaics?
Well, photovoltaics is a more well-developed industry than community wind, right? There's thousands of PV systems that have been put up, and they've got that down to a science, and they just crank them out. Whereas community wind projects are really still very much one-offs, and you know, somebody had to be paying for the 2 years of time spent arguing with the county council. So those kinds of costs are wrapped into it too.
I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
I would like to thank Alex again and present Alex with one of his complimentary, one of the not available stores in Super Energy Studies for Bellingham.
Thank you.
And I hope to see a lot of you again next quarter.